Welcome to McNulty's Book Corral. Today we're going to visit that magical place, Raintree County, a wonderful book by the late Ross Lockridge Jr. And let me begin with a little quotation from the beginning of the book. Raintree County, which had no boundaries in time and space, where lurked musical and strange names and mythical and lost peoples, and which was itself only a name, musical and strange. For Raintree County is not the country of the perishable fact. It is the country of the enduring fiction. The clock in the courthouse tower on page 5 of the Raintree County Atlas is always fixed at 9 o'clock, and it is summer, and the days are long. And so begins one of the most remarkable books I've ever read in my life, and it's 1,000 pages of some of the most heartfelt poetic prose you'll ever encounter. Before we get into that, however, I want to mention a little bit about Ross Lockridge Jr. and some of the tragedies associated with this incredible book. Ross Lockridge Jr. was an academic. He was a professor of literature. He was well-versed in the classics, Byron, Keats, Shelley, William Shakespeare. He was clearly influenced by Ulysses by James Joyce. I think Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman, and undoubtedly many, many others. He had, by all accounts, a fantastic articulate mind. He had dashing movie star looks. In fact, he resembled Tyrone Power. So let me take a look here. Take a look at this picture on the back. I have a better photo of Ross Lockridge that I'll post at the end of this. And this is the original dust jacket, by the way, which Ross Lockridge designed himself. The story behind the book is rather famous. He wrote the book over a period of about 7 or 8 years, and then the manuscript, the published book is 1,000 pages. The manuscript was double that. And he put the manuscript into a suitcase, traveled to New York. He did not have a literary agent. He walked into the editorial offices of Houghton Mifflin in New York, that's a tongue twister, and talked to an editor, and history was then made. The book was published in, I think, January of 1948, and Ross Lockridge Jr. committed suicide on March 6, 1948, right when the book went to number 1 on the bestseller list, leaving behind 4 young children and a wife. That's the first tragedy associated with it, and perhaps the most profound. His loss is immeasurable, especially to the family. We can only imagine what that was like. There is a book about that, written by his son, Larry Lockridge, who is himself a noted academic scholar who recently retired and is now publishing his own books. Here's a better photo of Ross Lockridge on the cover of the biography written by his son, and you can see he clearly resembles Tyrone Power. It's remarkable. And by all accounts, again, he was quite charming, articulate, fun to be around, but he suffered from some emotional and mental issues that were left untreated. There really weren't very good treatments for that type of thing in 1948, and he committed suicide by asphyxiating himself with carbon monoxide in his garage by hooking up the exhaust to a hose. That's the first stunning and horrifying tragedy that occurred in relation to the book. There's another one, which you may have heard of if you're familiar with the film version, starring Elizabeth Taylor and Montgomery Clift. The film was released in December of 1957. It kind of has a cult following. The beautiful photography, the enormous sets, the elaborate costumes, the musical score, the lush orchestration. There's even a song at the end, I think, by Nat King Cole, that was quite popular when the film came out. I don't like the film at all, which is unusual for me because I am a film buff. However, the film lacks anything relating to quality in relation to the book. They took basic elements from the book and tried to make a movie out of it. Elizabeth Taylor, I believe, was nominated for an Academy Award for her performance. The acting is quite good. It's the script that's awful. But the tragedy that occurred during the filming of the movie with Montgomery Clift, who was a very close friend with Elizabeth Taylor. For those of you familiar with Montgomery Clift, he was another of those great actors. Take a look at him in Red River with John Wayne. He had incredibly dashing good looks. And during the filming, he was coming home from a party at Elizabeth Taylor's house, and he crashed his automobile and nearly died. He was saved, obviously, and his face was destroyed, which means that they had to do facial reconstruction. And within 3 or 4 months, he returned to filming, and the film is probably more notable because of the differences in his appearance than for anything else. You can clearly see his good looks were destroyed forever. This also reportedly led Montgomery Clift to begin taking narcotics because of the ongoing pain that he would experience for the remainder of his short life. That was a direct result of the accident. His jaw had been destroyed, his nose, everything had been shattered, and they had to put him back together. It's clearly visible in certain scenes in the film, and people watching the film can see the difference in his appearance. He goes from a very dashing, young, handsome, highly acclaimed actor to his face is sort of rounded and still swollen, I think, if you look at the film in certain scenes. They did their best with him. He still looks like Montgomery Clift, but clearly he's a different person. And he would die in 1966. They called it, I think they've referred to his death as a lingering death. He did have some really fine film performances after that, but it was never the same after the automobile accident that nearly killed him while filming Raintree County. So that trivia is forever linked to this wonderful book, which I think is a masterpiece. So the book is kind of interesting. It's really long, and it's a challenge to read. It commences on July 4th, 1892. It takes place in one day and is told in flashbacks to various points in the life of a young man named John Wycliffe Shaughnessy, who is a young writer. And it's a story about his life. It goes back to his life before the Civil War, and then, of course, the Civil War intrudes upon his idyllic life in Raintree County, and it talks about his coming back to Raintree County at the end, and it goes back and forth throughout the entire book, 4,000 pages. It's the quality of the writing that will keep you spellbound. The many themes include the political differences that divided the country during the Civil War, very relevant today because some of those political differences are still here, obviously, and they still exist. Ross Lockridge was concerned about the Industrial Revolution. He saw that as kind of a threat in how it affected young Shaughnessy, and so forth and so on. So there are a lot of motifs and themes inherent in the text. Is unavoidable. There's a lot of strong sexual content too, which was quite scandalous at the time. I think it was either Life or Look magazine, I forget which, actually did an excerpt from the book shortly before its publication, which was a scandalous scene at the time where the young girl is swimming in the river. The river, by the way, is a motif in the book representing the river of time. You might think of it that way. And she's swimming nude in the river, and that sort of lent itself to some scandal and controversy, which Ross Lockridge Jr. may have been embarrassed by. Yet he wrote the book that was in him to write, and it is a magnificent book. I have another copy here. This copy that I'm holding here actually belonged to my wife's grandmother, Olga, and she gave me this book. She didn't have very many books, and when she was moving to an assisted living facility, I think she had 3 books on her shelf, including 4 if you include the family Bible. And the fact that she had Raintree County always struck me as interesting because the book was such a big bestseller, and it is so beautifully written that it's hard to ignore. So if you get a chance, you can find copies of it. There is paperback editions out there. The first edition, the second printing, third printing, both of these you see here. This is a first edition, and then this, I think, is like a third or fourth edition with the actual dust jacket on it. Again, this is the picture of him on the back. So I have those 2 editions that I would never part with, because I think the book is just one of those great books, And then I wanted to mention again, Shade of the Raintree, The Life and Death of Ross Lockridge Jr. by Larry Lockridge, which is illustrated with personal photographs from the family collection. But more importantly, this book, he is an academic scholar himself, so he decided to research his own father's life. And keep in mind, I think he was probably 5 or 6 years old when his father died. And he didn't hold back on anything. He reported what he found, as a good researcher and biographer would do. And it's really quite the heartbreaking tale of Ross Lockridge Jr. and the lost potential and the effect it had on the family. It's a pretty stunning tale by itself. It's just an American tragedy. And yet fortunately, we have Raintree County, which is still out there. I don't know if there's a current edition. I know a few years ago there was a reprint edition done in paperback, large size paperback. So for those of you interested in this type of literature, go ahead and see if you can find it. It's one of those books, like Moby Dick, which I have an episode devoted to, which you need to take your time with. Set goals for yourself, take notes, write out your questions, what are the things that interest you, and so forth. But pay attention to the quality of the writing. And a little excerpt. This is an excerpt that my friend Dave Etter actually used as an epigram to one of his poems, or one of his poetry books. Dave Etter was an American poet, and I'll cover him in a different episode. And he was quite fond of this book as well. In fact, he was one of the first people to recommend I read this book, which I didn't do until I got the copy from Olga Carlson, my wife's grandmother, a wonderful lady. So I treasure this. So here's a little bit that Dave Etter thought was a wonderful quote. "The river of your life flowed from a more distant source than you suspected." The river of your life flowed from a more distant source than you suspected. We get right into the poetry. "It rises still, a devious flood between green banks of summer. It is there forever, tracing a prophecy across the earth." Just a little sample of the type of lush, poetic writing that you'll find in this amazing tale, which begins on July 4th, 1892, and set in this mystical place called Raintree County. And so again, I sincerely hope you get a chance to read it. It's a great book. So, I can't resist doing an episode about the great works of literature. We certainly wish Ross Lockridge Jr. had lived. We can only speculate on what he would have published had he lived. But we have this book. Check it out. Find it. You can find it on Amazon. I think you can find multiple editions on eBay. Stay well, stay happy, feed your brain, and find yourself a copy of Raintree County.